There comes a moment in an empath's life when the old way of surviving quietly collapses. Not loudly, not dramatically, but internally, like a truth finally becoming too heavy to ignore. This sermon is not about becoming colder, harder, or less caring. It is about the moment you realize that empathy without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. The empath's last transformation is not a betrayal of who you were, it is the first act of loyalty to yourself. After this point, you don't disappear, you re-emerge differently, more aware, less available to misuse, no longer shaped by guilt, fear, or the need to be needed. This is the internal shift where your nervous system, your identity, and your sense of worth realign. Once this happens, you cannot unsee what you have seen, and you cannot return to the version of yourself that survived by shrinking. Empaths are rarely born into environments where their sensitivity is celebrated. More often, their ability to feel deeply develops as a survival adaptation. When a child grows up in emotional unpredictability, tension, neglect, or unspoken pain, they learn very early that safety depends on awareness. They become experts at reading the room, anticipating shifts in mood, and adjusting themselves accordingly. This sensitivity is not a personality trait first, it is a strategy. Over time, the nervous system learns that connection is maintained by being useful, calming others, or absorbing emotional weight so it doesn't explode elsewhere. As this child grows, overgiving becomes normalized. It feels moral, it feels loving, it feels like identity. They are praised for being mature, understanding, selfless. Rarely is anyone curious about the cost. Rarely does anyone ask what happens inside them when their own needs are postponed again and again. The empath learns that their value is relational, earned through emotional labor rather than inherent existence. This belief becomes so ingrained that rest feels uncomfortable, boundaries feel selfish, and receiving feels undeserved. Conditioning teaches the empath that love is something you do, not something you are allowed to expect. So they overextend emotionally, listening longer than they can hold, forgiving before healing, staying after clarity arrives. They confuse endurance with devotion. The body, however, keeps score. Emotional fatigue accumulates quietly. Resentment doesn't come from lack of compassion, it comes from chronic self-erasure. Empaths are also conditioned to overgive because they are taught, directly or indirectly, that other people's emotions are their responsibility. When someone is disappointed, angry, distant, or wounded, the empath feels compelled to fix it. Not out of arrogance, but out of fear. A fear that disconnection equals danger. A fear learned in moments where love felt conditional. So they rush to restore harmony, even when it costs their authenticity. Over time, this pattern attracts relationships where imbalance feels normal. The empath gives clarity, patience, forgiveness, emotional regulation, and receives confusion, inconsistency, and silence. Still they stay, because leaving feels like failure, because choosing themselves feels like abandonment of others. The conditioning whispers that their role is to carry, not to be carried. What breaks this pattern is not anger first, it is exhaustion, a deep, cellular exhaustion where the body refuses to keep sacrificing itself for approval. The empath reaches a point where empathy without self-respect becomes intolerable. They begin to notice how often their kindness was actually compliance, how often their listening was self-neglect, how often their loyalty was fear-based. This realization is destabilizing because it challenges the empath's self-image. If I stop overgiving, who am I? If I say no, will I still be loved? If I stop absorbing others' pain, what will remain of my identity? These questions arise not because the empath is losing compassion, but because they are discovering differentiation, the ability to exist without merging. The transformation begins when the empath understands that empathy does not require self-sacrifice, that compassion does not mean tolerating harm, that love is not proven by how much you can endure. The nervous system slowly learns a new truth: safety can exist without overextension. Connection does not have to cost authenticity. Presence does not require performance. This is why the empath's last transformation feels lonely at first. The old dynamics no longer fit. People accustomed to unrestricted access feel confused or threatened. The empath themselves feels guilt, grief, and disorientation. But beneath that discomfort is relief. A quiet relief that comes from no longer betraying the self in the name of peace. A relief that signals the end of survival-based empathy and the beginning of embodied, grounded compassion that includes the self as worthy of care. The hidden cost of emotional hyper-attunement is not immediately visible because it masquerades as strength. The empath notices subtle shifts others miss. A tightening jaw, a change in tone, a silence that speaks louder than words. This attunement often earns admiration. People feel understood, soothed, regulated in the empath's presence. But what is rarely acknowledged is that this constant outward focus pulls attention away from the self. The empath becomes fluent in others' inner worlds while remaining largely disconnected from their own bodily signals. Emotional hyper-attunement develops when the nervous system learns that awareness equals safety. The empath scans continuously, not out of curiosity but out of necessity. This vigilance does not switch off when danger passes because the body never received confirmation that it is safe to rest. Over time, this creates a state of low, great anxiety that feels normal. The empath may not label it as fear, but it lives as tension, fatigue, digestive issues, headaches, or emotional numbness. The cost deepens because hyper-attunement distorts responsibility. When you are constantly aware of others' emotions, it becomes easy to believe you caused them. A sigh feels like failure. Withdrawal feels like rejection. Someone else's discomfort becomes a personal indictment. The empath internalizes the belief that harmony depends on their performance. This leads to chronic self-monitoring, where spontaneity is replaced by calculation and authenticity is filtered through the question of how it will land. Another hidden cost is the loss of emotional reciprocity. Hyper-attuned individuals often give more than they receive because they notice needs before they are voiced. They offer comfort before it is requested, understanding before it is earned. This trains others unintentionally to rely without reciprocating. The empath becomes the container rather than the participant. Over time, this creates relational asymmetry that feels lonely even in connection. Emotional hyper-attunement also interferes with anger. Anger is a boundary emotion. It signals violation, overreach, misalignment. But for the empath, anger often feels dangerous because it threatens connection. Instead of being expressed outwardly, it turns inward as guilt, shame, or self-criticism. The empath tells themselves they are too sensitive, too needy, too much. The body, however, continues to register the boundary breach. This suppression has physiological consequences. A nervous system locked in attunement cannot fully regulate. The empath may struggle to sleep, to relax, to feel pleasure without scanning for disturbance. Joy feels fragile because it depends on everyone else being okay. Stillness feels unfamiliar because awareness has become a reflex. The body confuses rest with vulnerability. Hyper-attunement also fragments identity. When attention is habitually external, the empath loses clarity about personal desires, preferences, and limits. Decisions are made based on impact rather than truth. Life becomes a series of accommodations. Over time, the empath may feel strangely empty, not because they lack depth, but because their depth has been continuously exported. The transformation begins with noticing the cost without self-judgment. Emotional attunement is not wrong. It is simply incomplete when it excludes the self. Healing does not require becoming indifferent. It requires rebalancing attention. The empath learns to pause before responding, to check internally before adjusting externally. This feels uncomfortable at first because it interrupts an old survival rhythm. As awareness turns inward, grief often surfaces. Grief for how long the body stayed alert. Grief for the needs that went unnoticed. Grief for the relationships maintained at the expense of self-connection. This grief is not regression, it is integration. It marks the nervous system beginning to trust that presence does not require vigilance. The empath's last transformation involves redefining empathy as mutual presence rather than one-sided absorption. Emotional information becomes something to notice, not something to manage. Other people's feelings are allowed to exist without immediate intervention. This shift frees enormous energy previously spent on regulation and repair. When hyper-attunement softens, clarity sharpens. Boundaries become easier because the empath can distinguish between resonance and responsibility. Compassion becomes grounded rather than reactive. The body begins to experience moments of neutrality, not numbness, but calm. In this space, the empath starts to feel themselves again, not as a role, not as a function, but as a living system allowed to respond at its own pace, guided by internal signals rather than external demands, resting in the unfamiliar but steady sensation of not needing to fix, not needing to anticipate, not needing to carry. Just being present within their own skin. Trauma teaches its most convincing lessons quietly. It does not announce itself as harm, it presents itself as duty. When love is inconsistent, conditional, or paired with emotional instability, the nervous system learns that connection must be maintained through vigilance and effort. Responsibility becomes the currency of belonging. The child learns that being needed is safer than being free, that managing others' emotions reduces risk, that staying attentive prevents loss. Over time, this pattern becomes indistinguishable from love itself. In traumatic environments, responsibility is often assigned prematurely. The child may become the emotional stabilizer, the mediator, the caretaker, the silent observer who keeps things from falling apart. Even when not explicitly asked, the child senses what is required and steps into it. This early role reversal wires the belief that love means holding weight that does not belong to you. The nervous system associates closeness with burden and intimacy with obligation. As this child grows into adulthood, relationships feel familiar when they require effort, sacrifice, and emotional labor. Ease feels suspicious, mutuality feels unfamiliar. When someone needs help, the trauma-conditioned empath feels activated, purposeful, valuable. When someone is emotionally regulated and self-sufficient, the empath may feel irrelevant or disconnected. Responsibility has become a substitute for intimacy. This is why trauma survivors often stay in relationships where they are over-functioning. They confuse exhaustion with commitment. They interpret self-neglect as loyalty. When they feel drained, they assume they are doing something right. The body, however, experiences these dynamics as ongoing threat. Chronic responsibility keeps the nervous system in a state of mobilization, always preparing to respond, intervene, rescue. Trauma also distorts guilt. The empath feels guilty for wanting space, guilty for having needs, guilty for saying no. This guilt is not moral, it is physiological. The nervous system has learned that withdrawal precedes rupture. Saying no feels like abandonment. Choosing oneself feels like betrayal. Responsibility becomes a way to prevent the pain of disconnection, even when the cost is internal collapse. Another layer of this conditioning is the belief that love must be earned. Trauma teaches that being oneself is not enough. Affection arrives when the empath is useful, compliant, understanding, patient. Over time, the empath internalizes the idea that rest is laziness, boundaries are rejection, and self-care is indulgence. They stay hyper-available, emotionally accessible, and endlessly accommodating, believing this is what makes them lovable. This pattern often recreates the original wound. The empath attracts partners, friends, or systems that unconsciously expect them to carry emotional responsibility, not because the empath seeks harm, but because familiarity feels safe. The nervous system gravitates toward what it knows how to survive. Responsibility feels predictable, mutual support feels uncertain. Breaking this pattern requires a painful re-education of the body. The empath must learn that love does not require self-erasure, that care can exist without control, that responsibility for another adult's emotions is not intimacy, it is reenactment. This realization often triggers grief because it means acknowledging how much was carried unnecessarily. As awareness grows, the empath begins to notice resentment surfacing where devotion once lived. This is not cruelty, it is information. Resentment signals misalignment between effort and reciprocity. It reveals where responsibility has replaced consent. Many trauma survivors fear this resentment, believing it makes them unkind. In truth, it marks the nervous system reclaiming its boundaries. The most difficult shift comes when the empath stops rescuing, when they allow others to feel disappointed, uncomfortable, or responsible for their own emotions. This feels like abandonment at first because it contradicts early survival strategies. The body expects punishment, rejection, or collapse. Instead, something else begins to happen. The nervous system experiences moments of relief. Trauma healing involves separating love from labor. It involves allowing connection to be imperfect, unrescued, unmaintained by constant effort. This does not mean withdrawing care. It means returning responsibility to where it belongs. Love becomes a shared experience rather than a role one person performs. As the empath releases the belief that responsibility equals love, identity shifts. They begin to notice their own impulses, desires, and limits without immediately overriding them. Choice replaces compulsion. Presence replaces performance. The body starts to experience connection without activation, intimacy without fear, closeness without self-loss. This is not the loss of love. It is the first time love is allowed to exist without survival attached to it. The moment empathy turns into self-betrayal is rarely dramatic. It does not arrive as a clear decision or a conscious trade-off. It shows up quietly, in small moments where the empath feels a subtle tightening in the chest and ignores it. A pause that never happens. A truth that is softened until it disappears. A boundary sensed but not spoken. Over time, these moments accumulate into a pattern where the empath is no longer choosing compassion, but defaulting to self-erasure. Self-betrayal begins when empathy is disconnected from self-awareness. The empath notices what others feel but dismisses what they themselves experience. Discomfort is reframed as sensitivity. Exhaustion is reframed as weakness. Hurt is reframed as misunderstanding. This internal translation happens so automatically that the empath believes they are being generous, when in reality they are abandoning themselves to maintain external stability. Empathy becomes self-betrayal when it is driven by fear rather than presence, fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood or unloved. In this state, the empath prioritizes emotional safety outside themselves while ignoring emotional safety within. They tolerate inconsistency, invalidation, or disrespect because confronting it feels more dangerous than enduring it. The nervous system equates harmony with survival, even if that harmony is built on silence. One of the clearest signs of this shift is the loss of consent. The empath gives not because they want to, but because they feel they should. Their yes is automatic, not embodied. Their generosity is compulsive, not chosen. Over time, this creates a disconnect between action and truth. The body participates in relationships the inner self has already outgrown. Self-betrayal also shows up in how the empath explains away harm. They contextualize others' behavior with endless understanding. They see the wound behind the action and minimize the impact on themselves. While context can foster compassion, it becomes self-betrayal when it replaces accountability. Understanding someone's pain does not require tolerating its projection onto you. As this pattern continues, the empath begins to feel a quiet resentment that feels shameful. They tell themselves they should be more patient, more forgiving, more evolved. But resentment is not a failure of empathy. It is a signal that empathy has been extended beyond its healthy range. It indicates that the self has been left out of the equation. The body reacts to self-betrayal before the mind does. Fatigue deepens, motivation fades, emotional numbness alternates with overwhelm. The empath may feel disconnected from joy, creativity, or desire. These are not signs of depression alone. They are signs of an internal system that has learned its signals will not be honored. The turning point comes when the empath recognizes that empathy without boundaries is not kindness. It is self-harm. This realization can feel destabilizing because it challenges the moral identity built around being understanding and accommodating. The empath may fear becoming cold, selfish, or unloving, but what actually changes is not the capacity for care, but the direction in which it flows. Choosing oneself for the first time feels unnatural. Saying no feels heavier than saying yes ever did. Allowing others to experience disappointment feels cruel. The empath may feel a surge of guilt that does not match the reality of the situation. This guilt is not evidence of wrongdoing. It is residue from a nervous system trained to equate self-assertion with danger. As the empath begins to honor internal signals, clarity emerges. They start to notice which relationships rely on their silence to function, which connections collapse when they stop over-explaining, which bonds were sustained by their willingness to tolerate misalignment. This awareness is painful, but it is also liberating. It reveals that some relationships were not mutual, they were maintained. Empathy returns to its rightful place when it includes the self. The empath learns to listen inward before responding outward. They allow discomfort to exist without rushing to soothe it. They speak truth even when it disrupts the emotional atmosphere. This does not harden them, it grounds them. Self-betrayal ends when the empath understands that their feelings are not obstacles to connection, but guides. That their discomfort is not something to override, but something to respect. That empathy does not require disappearing. It requires presence, and presence cannot exist where the self is consistently denied. Guilt often intensifies right before transformation because the nervous system interprets change as threat. When an empath begins to shift, to pull back, to pause before responding, old internal alarms activate. These alarms are not moral signals, they are survival signals. They originate from earlier experiences where withdrawal led to punishment, abandonment, or emotional rupture. As the empath steps out of familiar patterns, the body reacts as if something dangerous is about to happen. This guilt is confusing because it appears precisely when the empath starts doing something healthy, saying no, taking space, speaking honestly, resting without explanation. Each of these actions contradicts a deeply ingrained belief that connection must be earned through effort. The empath may feel selfish, ungrateful, or cold, even when their behavior is reasonable and measured. This emotional response is not evidence of wrongdoing. It is evidence of conditioning being challenged. Guilt intensifies because the old identity is being threatened. The empath has often been valued for accessibility, emotional availability, and reliability. When those traits are reduced or restructured, the psyche fears loss of belonging. The question beneath the guilt is rarely, am I doing something wrong? But will I still be loved if I stop doing this? Guilt becomes the mind's attempt to pull the empath back into familiar roles where acceptance felt predictable. There is also a relational component to this guilt. People accustomed to the empath's overgiving may respond with confusion, disappointment, or subtle pressure. These reactions reinforce the internal narrative that the empath is failing. The empath feels responsible for others' discomfort, even when that discomfort arises from unmet expectations rather than actual harm. This reinforces the belief that transformation causes pain, when in reality it reveals where balance never existed. Guilt peaks during transformation because the empath is no longer regulating others' emotions. When they stop smoothing edges, absorbing tension, or anticipating needs, emotional energy shifts back to its rightful owners. This can create visible discomfort in others, which the empath instinctively wants to alleviate. Resisting that urge feels unnatural at first. The guilt arises from breaking an unspoken contract that was never consciously agreed to. Another reason guilt intensifies is that self-compassion is still underdeveloped. The empath is skilled at extending understanding outward, but often struggles to offer the same grace inward. When they prioritize themselves, there is no internal model for reassurance. The absence of that inner voice creates a vacuum filled by self-criticism. The empath assumes they must justify their needs rather than trust them. This stage of guilt is often accompanied by doubt. The empath may question whether they are misinterpreting the situation, being too sensitive, or overreacting. This self-doubt is familiar. It has protected connection in the past. But during transformation, it delays integration. The empath is learning to trust internal signals rather than external validation, and guilt flares as that trust is tested. The body experiences this guilt physically: tightness in the chest, a knot in the stomach, a restless urge to fix, explain, or revert. These sensations are not signs of intuition warning against harm. They are remnants of an old safety system trying to restore equilibrium. The body has not yet learned that boundaries can coexist with connection. As transformation progresses, the empath begins to notice a paradox. When they tolerate the guilt without acting on it, nothing catastrophic happens. Relationships that are resilient adjust. Relationships that depended on overgiving destabilize. This differentiation is painful but clarifying. The guilt begins to lose its authority as a moral guide and reveals itself as a transitional emotion. The empath also starts to recognize that guilt has been used as a control mechanism, both externally and internally, not always intentionally but effectively. Guilt kept them compliant, accessible, and self-sacrificing. Releasing guilt feels like releasing identity. This is why it resists so strongly. Transformation requires staying present with guilt without letting it dictate behavior. This is not suppression, it is re-education. The empath learns that guilt does not require obedience. It requires curiosity. What is this feeling protecting? What belief is being challenged? What part of me learned that my needs were dangerous? As the empath continues to choose alignment over appeasement, guilt gradually shifts into grief. Grief for the years spent prioritizing others at personal cost. Grief for the younger self who learned to equate love with sacrifice. Grief for relationships that cannot evolve beyond old dynamics. This grief is cleaner than guilt. It does not demand self-punishment, it invites acknowledgement. The intensification of guilt marks proximity to freedom. It is the final tightening of an old system before it loosens. The empath does not become less caring through this process, they become more honest. Care is no longer fueled by fear of loss but by presence and choice. As guilt recedes, a quieter internal authority begins to form. One that does not argue, justify, or explain, but simply knows when something is aligned and when it is not, and allows action to emerge from that knowing rather than from obligation or fear. People pleasing is not a personality flaw. It is a nervous system strategy. It emerges when the body learns early on that connection is unpredictable and that safety depends on managing others' emotional states. The nervous system becomes attuned to external cues as a way to prevent rupture. This is not conscious manipulation, it is adaptation. The body is trying to maintain proximity, reduce threat, and preserve belonging. The autonomic nervous system plays a central role in this pattern. When the body perceives potential conflict, disapproval, or withdrawal, it activates survival responses. For many empaths, this response is not fight or flight but fawn. The fawn response prioritizes appeasement, compliance, and soothing others as a way to neutralize danger. People-pleasing, then, is the behavioral expression of a physiological state. Because this response is rooted in the body, logic alone cannot undo it. An empath may understand intellectually that it is okay to say no, yet feel intense anxiety when attempting to do so. The body reacts before the mind can intervene. Heart rate increases, muscles tense. Thoughts race. The nervous system signals that asserting a boundary could lead to loss of connection even when no real threat exists. This is why people-pleasing feels automatic. It bypasses conscious choice. The empath agrees before checking in, apologizes without clarity, over-explains to prevent misunderstanding. These behaviors momentarily reduce anxiety by restoring a sense of safety. The nervous system relaxes once harmony is re-established, reinforcing the pattern. Relief becomes mistaken for alignment. Over time, this cycle becomes exhausting. The nervous system remains in a state of hyperactivation, constantly scanning for emotional shifts. The body rarely reaches true rest because rest requires the absence of threat. If disapproval feels dangerous, then rest is always provisional. This leads to chronic fatigue, emotional burnout, and a diminished capacity for presence. The role of the nervous system also explains why people-pleasing persists even when it causes harm. The body is not oriented toward fulfillment. It is oriented toward survival. It prioritizes familiar safety over long-term well-being. Even when the empath recognizes that certain dynamics are draining or unequal, the nervous system resists change because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. Healing people-pleasing requires working with the body, not against it. The empath must learn to tolerate the sensations that arise when they do not appease. This includes the discomfort of silence, the anxiety of waiting, and the urge to repair. These sensations are not signs of danger. They are signs of a nervous system learning a new pattern. Small acts of boundary setting are essential in this process. Not because they are dramatic, but because they provide the body with new data. Each time the empath says no and survives, the nervous system updates its understanding of safety. Each time a boundary is respected, the body learns that connection does not always require compliance. Each time discomfort passes without catastrophe, trust begins to form internally. It is also important to recognize that people-pleasing is often rewarded socially. Empaths are praised for being easygoing, understanding, and accommodating. These reinforcements make it harder to step out of the role. When the empath begins to change, others may respond with surprise or resistance. This external feedback can reactivate the nervous system, making the old pattern feel tempting again. Regulation becomes the foundation for transformation. Practices that support nervous system regulation, slowing down, grounding, noticing bodily sensations, help the empath stay present during moments of discomfort. Instead of reacting, they learn to pause. Instead of appeasing, they learn to breathe. This pause creates space for choice. As regulation increases, the empath begins to differentiate between empathy and enmeshment. They can feel another's emotion without absorbing it. They can witness discomfort without rushing to fix it. The nervous system no longer interprets every emotional shift as a personal threat. This reduces the compulsion to manage and restore. People-pleasing dissolves not through force, but through safety. When the body learns that authenticity does not lead to abandonment, the need to appease diminishes. Boundaries begin to feel less like defenses and more like expressions of self-respect. The empath starts to experience connection that is not contingent on performance. The nervous system gradually shifts from hyper-vigilance to responsiveness. Instead of reacting to perceived threats, the empath responds to actual needs. Energy previously spent on monitoring and managing becomes available for creativity, rest, and genuine intimacy. This is not the loss of compassion. It is compassion grounded in regulation rather than fear, allowing the empath to show up as a whole person rather than a survival strategy in motion. When an empath begins to withdraw access, it is often interpreted as cruelty by those who benefited from their overextension. This misinterpretation is painful because the empath has been conditioned to equate care with availability. Limiting access feels harsh, final, and morally wrong even when it is necessary. But what is actually happening is not punishment or withdrawal of love. It is the natural emergence of consequence. For a long time, the empath's presence softened the impact of others' behaviors. Missed accountability was absorbed. Emotional inconsistency was explained away. Disrespect was tolerated under the banner of understanding. The empath buffered relationships from reality by compensating for imbalance. When that buffering stops, reality becomes visible. People are suddenly faced with the effects of their actions without insulation. Losing access to an empath feels abrupt only because the access was previously unrestricted. There were few limits, few conditions, few pauses. Availability was assumed rather than earned. When boundaries appear, they are experienced as loss, even though what is actually happening is correction. The empath is no longer over-functioning to preserve comfort for others. This shift often triggers guilt in the empath because it activates old fears of abandonment and rejection. The empath may worry they are being punitive or emotionally withholding. In truth, they are allowing relationships to respond to truth rather than accommodation. Consequence is not cruelty, it is clarity. It reveals which connections were sustained by mutual respect and which relied on self-sacrifice. People accustomed to constant access may escalate when it is removed. They may accuse the empath of changing, becoming cold, or forgetting who they are. These reactions are attempts to restore the old dynamic, not reflections of reality. The empath is not becoming less compassionate, they are becoming less available to misuse. This distinction is difficult for others to accept when they have never been required to consider the empath's limits. Consequences also allow responsibility to return to its rightful place. When the empath no longer intervenes, rescues, or soothes, others must confront their own emotions and behaviors. This can feel uncomfortable, even destabilizing. But discomfort is not harm. Growth often begins where buffering ends. The empath's transformation challenges a cultural narrative that equates kindness with endurance. When they stop tolerating harm quietly, they disrupt expectations. The fear of being seen as unkind is powerful because it threatens identity. The empath may question whether they are still good, still loving, still worthy. But goodness does not require self-abandonment. Love does not require unlimited access. There is also grief in this stage. Grief for how much was given without return. Grief for the hope that others would eventually notice and reciprocate. Grief for relationships that cannot survive without imbalance. This grief does not mean the boundary was wrong, it means the empath cared deeply. Letting go of access is not indifference. It is acknowledgement that care alone cannot sustain what lacks mutuality. As access becomes intentional, the empath begins to experience a new kind of peace. Not the fragile peace that depends on everyone else being okay, but a grounded peace rooted in self-trust. Silence becomes less threatening. Distance becomes informative rather than frightening. The empath can observe how people respond when effort is no longer one-sided. Some relationships will adapt. They will slow down, recalibrate, and meet the empath with respect. Others will fade, resist, or collapse. This differentiation is painful, but it is also honest. It shows where connection was reciprocal and where it was maintained by over-giving. Consequence restores dignity. It allows the empath to remain compassionate without compromising self-respect. It removes the need for explanation, justification, or emotional labor. Boundaries speak for themselves. Access becomes a privilege aligned with behavior rather than a default offering. The most difficult part of this stage is tolerating misunderstanding. The empath may be seen as distant by those who only felt closeness through consumption. They may be judged by those who benefited from their silence. Accepting this misinterpretation requires internal anchoring. The empath must trust their internal signals over external narratives. As this trust strengthens, the empath no longer chases resolution. They allow space to do its work. They recognize that access given without discernment invites misuse, while access given with intention invites respect. The transformation becomes visible not in confrontation, but in consistency. Losing access to the empath is not an act of harm, it is the natural outcome of patterns no longer being sustained. It is not withdrawal of love, it is withdrawal of self-erasure. In this space, the empath stands steady, no longer negotiating their worth, no longer cushioning others from consequence, allowing truth to shape connection without interference. After the transformation, relationships can no longer survive on potential, intention, or history alone. The empath's internal shift alters the foundation on which connection rests. What once felt tolerable now feels dissonant. What once could be explained now feels misaligned. This is not a loss of patience, it is the emergence of discernment. Relationships must now meet the empath at truth rather than hope. Before this transformation, the empath often related through projection. They saw who someone could become, who they once were, or who they might be under better circumstances. This allowed the empath to stay invested even when behavior contradicted values. After the transformation, perception sharpens. The empath no longer fills in gaps with understanding. They observe what is actually present. Truth replaces interpretation. Meeting at truth means that words are no longer enough. Promises without follow-through lose their persuasive power. Emotional expressions unsupported by action feel hollow. The empath becomes sensitive not just to feeling states, but to patterns. Consistency becomes the new language of safety. Without it, connection feels unstable, regardless of emotional intensity. This shift can feel abrupt to others because the empath stops negotiating reality. They no longer reinterpret harm as misunderstanding. They no longer accept partial accountability as effort. They no longer confuse emotional intimacy with relational integrity. What once passed as closeness now requires congruence between intention and behavior. After transformation, the empath also changes how they participate. They no longer chase clarity or resolution. They express themselves once cleanly and observe the response. If truth is met with defensiveness, minimization, or avoidance, the empath does not pursue. Silence becomes an answer. Distance becomes information. This is not withdrawal, it is responsiveness. Relationships that survive this stage do so because they are willing to be real. They can tolerate discomfort. They can hear feedback without collapse or retaliation. They can adjust behavior rather than defend identity. These connections deepen because they are not propped up by one person's effort. They become collaborative rather than compensatory. Relationships that cannot meet at truth often attempt to re-engage the empath through guilt, nostalgia, or emotional appeal. They reference shared history or past closeness. The empath feels the pull because memory still carries warmth. But after transformation, memory no longer overrides present reality. The empath understands that who someone was is not who they are now, and who they might become is not who they are choosing to be. This stage requires tolerating disappointment without self-blame. The empath may grieve connections that cannot evolve. They may feel sadness without regret, loss without confusion. This clarity is unfamiliar because it is not dramatic. It does not involve conflict or collapse. It involves quiet recognition. Meeting at truth also means the empath becomes more visible. They no longer shrink to maintain harmony. They express preferences, limits, and values without excessive explanation. This visibility can feel vulnerable because it removes ambiguity. Others can now clearly choose whether to engage respectfully or step away. The empath also learns that truth does not need to be delivered forcefully to be firm. They speak calmly, directly, and sparingly. There is no need to convince. Truth stands on its own. This changes the power dynamic. Manipulation loses effectiveness when clarity replaces confusion. As relationships recalibrate, the empath's nervous system responds differently. There is less hypervigilance, less monitoring, less emotional labor. The body begins to associate connection with ease rather than effort. This ease is not excitement or intensity, it is steadiness. It signals compatibility rather than chemistry driven by survival patterns. Meeting at truth also means accepting that not everyone is capable of it. Some people rely on distortion, avoidance, or control to feel safe. The empath no longer tries to rescue them from that reality. They recognize that healing cannot be outsourced and insight cannot be forced. Respect replaces rescue. This final transformation does not make the empath rigid. It makes them precise. They remain open, warm, and emotionally available, but only where there is mutual presence. They no longer offer access in advance of trust. Trust is built through alignment, not persuasion. Relationships after this point feel quieter, slower, and more grounded. They are not fueled by intensity or urgency. They are sustained by choice. The empath no longer confuses connection with closeness alone. They understand that intimacy without integrity erodes safety. Meeting at truth becomes the new standard. Not perfection, but honesty. Not agreement, but respect. Not constant availability, but reliable presence. In this space, the empath does not perform connection. They participate in it, standing fully within themselves, allowing relationships to rise or fall based on reality rather than sacrifice.